The number one question on the mind of every organism on Earth, if that organism happens to have a mind, is how do I make more of myself? It's bigger than all the other questions combined, including how am I going to feed myself and what's the meaning of life? Because from a biological perspective, we know what the meaning of life is. Biology has answered that question. It's reproduction. Different organisms go about reproducing in different ways. You can make more of yourself by yourself, a strategy called asexual reproduction, or you can team up with somebody else and make a baby that's genetically different from both of you through sexual reproduction. From liver flukes to pine trees, 99% of eukaryotic organisms on Earth use sex to reproduce at least some of the time. And that's because creating offspring with a slightly different genome helps the new generation stay one step ahead of pathogens or competitors, or if you're the pathogen, it helps you stay ahead of that pesky host that's always trying to kick you out. But still, sex is inconvenient and it's a lot of work. First, you gotta find somebody to mate with, which means you have to get out of bed and brush your teeth and stuff. Then, if you're an animal, you have to find somebody who's willing to mate with you, and then figure out whether he or she is gonna provide higher or lower quality genes than yours. Thankfully, and unsurprisingly, animals' reproductive systems have evolved to streamline all of those inconveniences to address one and only one aim: to get your sex cells where they need to be. So sex, how does it work? I thought you'd never ask. Reproductive systems, like all the other systems we've discussed, take on an incredible diversity within kingdom Animalia. For instance, some female spiders mate with a bunch of different males and then stash their sperm into different storage units. When she's ready to fertilize her eggs, the female spider will choose which male spider she liked the best, and then let his sperm out of the storage unit to fertilize her eggs. Hyenas, meanwhile, have a female-dominated social system, and it's the alpha female who chooses who she mates with. She has sex using an enlarged sensitive sex organ, a clitoris, that looks exactly like a penis, called a pseudopenis. And a duck's penis can be a quarter of the length of its body and shaped like a corkscrew. Wanna know why? Look it up. Actually, don't. Google that with care. Just don't press play on the video. The point here is that while the delivery systems may be somewhat different from animal to animal, the fundamentals are the same. In order to do the sex, an organism needs to find another of its species that has a different type of gamete, or sex cell, than their own. Gametes, you'll recall, are haploid cells, meaning that they only have one set of chromosomes, and they're formed by the process of meiosis. And there are only two types of gametes. One is the ovum or egg. In plants, it's called the ovule. The egg is always a large cell that takes a lot of time and energy investment to make, and it's usually not very mobile. The other type of gamete, sperm, are smaller, a lot more plentiful, and easy to make, and always more mobile than eggs. Most animals have either one or the other type of gamete, though hermaphroditic species like garden snails and some flowering plants can produce both. In the magical moment that one of these sperm finds one of those eggs, the two fuse together to create a single diploid cell that has all of the instructions to make a new seahorse or secretary bird or whatever it is. But let me get your mind right about what we really mean when we talk about sex. Because we humans have external sex organs called genitals, we tend to think of them as key indicators of who's male and who's female. But the fact is, genitals are only one byproduct of a much, much more important and fundamental distinction. From a biological perspective, the only thing that makes sexes different is that the females produce big, not very mobile gametes, and the males make smaller, much more mobile gametes. Across the spectrum of all things that reproduce sexually, that's pretty much the only consistent difference between boys and girls. Therefore, all reproductive systems and reproductive behavior are designed entirely around the production, storage, and delivery of these gametes. For instance, because sperm are really mobile, males within a species are generally the more mobile ones who go out to find a mate. This is even true for plants. Female gametes of a flowering plant generally stay in one place, while the pollen, which ends up producing the sperm, gets picked up by a pollinator or sometimes just sprays out every which way into the wind, hoping to bump into the right kind of ovule. In animals, we see all kinds of crazy behaviors where mating is concerned, and of course not every animal goes about courtship in the same way. But one thing is pretty consistent: females tend to be pickier about the quality of their mates. Because while a male animal could conceivably fertilize thousands of eggs every year, a female has only a limited number of eggs and she's spent a lot of energy developing them, so she wants them to be fertilized with high-quality genes. Plus, in cases where both parents stay together after fertilization, she also wants those genes to be attached to a high-quality provider. This often results in males having to do a lot of showing off in order to get a lady's attention. Males of a species are generally louder, larger, brighter, more combative than the females. Basically, they're putting on a big show so that the females can size up how awesome that guy's genes are. But for all those differences, during the development of the embryo, there are actually very few physical differences between males and females, at least at first. You and I, we didn't start out being a male or a female while we were hanging out in our mom's uteruses. We didn't have a sex at all until about 2 months. Before that, we had all the pieces to become either male or female, but our genes hadn't gotten together to determine whether or not our gonads, the glands that make the gametes, were going to become ovaries or testes. In mammals, that decision is made by the sex-determining chromosome. If an offspring has 2 of the same kind of sex-determining chromosome called XX, it will be female, and if it has 2 different chromosomes XY, it will be male. The same is true for other animals like fruit flies and even some plants like ginkgo trees. However, the opposite is true for birds. Boy birds have XX and girl birds have XY. Go figure. In mammals, the default setting for sex is always female. Absent of signal from the Y chromosome, ovaries form and begin working on developing female structures. If there is a Y, the ovaries instead form into testes, and parts that would be female turn into male structures. For instance, the clitoris I mentioned, which is sensitive and has spongy tissue in it, actually becomes part of a penis. But it is worth pointing out that by this time, some features are already in place before the sex is determined. Nipples, for instance, form before this point, so that's why men have them, even though they don't do anything. Now, once the sex is determined, the ovaries and testes pump out estrogen and testosterone. Meanwhile, the brain is growing and creating receptors organized differently in males and females that will later determine how both estrogen and testosterone are used by the body. Soon after a baby girl is born, she'll have half-formed versions of all the eggs she's ever going to have for her whole life. Then, at puberty, once a month, one of those eggs will finish forming and be released. But for baby boys, the sperm making does not begin until around puberty. Most of the time, when a young animal starts getting close to sexual maturity, secondary sex characteristics crop up. In humans, more body hair appears. Boys all of a sudden develop facial hair, while both sexes get more pubic hair. Also, muscle and fat get redistributed around the body, the most obvious examples being breasts. In other animals, secondary sex characteristics include things like manes on male lions, a big old funky rack of feathers on male peacocks, antlers on male deer. Males really have the market cornered on fancy, showy secondary sex characteristics. So by the time an animal has reached sexual maturity, the males and females of a species often look pretty dissimilar, not just of each other, but of their previous non-sexually developed forms. Basically showing the world that their different reproductive structures that they were born with are now in full gear, and they've got some really different jobs to do based on what sex they are. So let's go over how this all works with human people, and of course, ladies first. As you know, the gonads of a female embryo turn into 2 ovaries, one on either side of the uterus, with its oviducts or fallopian tubes reaching out toward them. The ovaries are where those precious eggs are kept. Maybe the biggest difference between women's and men's reproductive setup is that women have a menstrual cycle, typically a 4-week process, in which one egg matures in an ovary and is released to be drawn into the fallopian tubes, a process called ovulation. If, while the egg makes its way down the fallopian tube to the uterus, a sperm finds it and fertilizes it, there's a chance that the fertilized egg will implant on the endometrium, a tissue layer inside the wall of the uterus, and a baby will grow. However, it's estimated that up to 70% of fertilized eggs don't take hold in the endometrium. This could be because women's bodies have sort of a built-in genetic testing. If something's suspected to be wrong with the growing embryo, the lining of her uterus that she's built up over the past month will shed, and the woman will menstruate as usual. This material leaves the female reproductive system through the narrow lower end of the uterus, the cervix, and then out into the muscle-lined tract of the vagina. And those are, of course, the same structures through which a newborn baby passes and through which the sperm enter. While a woman's body is busy all month developing the next egg, getting it ready for fertilization, and shedding her uterine lining if it's not fertilized, males are undergoing a completely different process that calls on a lot of other highly specialized reproductive structures. We start, of course, with the testes, which are made up largely of a bunch of coiled tubes called seminiferous tubules, which are where the sperm form. Unlike a woman's ovaries, the testes are outside of the body because in order to make sperm, they have to be kept at a specific temperature, usually about 2 degrees cooler Celsius than inside the body cavity. For that reason, the testes are kept in a pouch called a scrotum that's in charge of keeping the testes at the perfect sperm-making temperature. After being produced in the testes, human sperm spend about 3 weeks coiled in tubes in the scrotum called the epididymis. And that's where they mature and grow flagella, the little whip-like tails that sperm are so famous for, which make them able to move around and swim. Now the sperm stay here until they're ready to leave the body, so before we or they can go any further, we have to set the stage for that. As you know, in humans and some other animals, the penis usually sits around not doing much except for letting urine out of the bladder from time to time, but every so often, a male realizes that he's totally gonna get the chance to mate. At this point, spongy tissue in the penis fills with blood, and bam, erection. Some animals like raccoons, whales, and walruses actually have a literal bone in their penis to help the erection along. But either way, the point is to allow the penis to enter the vagina, which scientists call coitus, and deposit the sperm he's put so much into making. These sperm travel in a special fluid, semen, whose ingredients aren't combined until they're ready to be released by a series of muscular contractions that cause emission, more commonly known as ejaculation. At this point, the contractions carry the mature sperm from the epididymis through two muscular ducts called the vas deferens, which carry them up from the testes, up and over the bladder, and down past the seminal vesicles. Here, with contributions from the nearby prostate gland, they pick up a bunch of fluid that contains mucus and coagulating enzyme, ascorbic acid, and sugars that the sperm are gonna need for their trip. Now the semen is complete, and it travels down short ejaculatory ducts to the urethra to be released at the end of the penis, where, if the timing is right, one among the hundreds of millions of sperm in that emission can find and fertilize an egg. That, my friends, is how we all get our start.
Hernia.
AIDS.
Ano ko yan? AIDS.
HIV.
Syphilis,
HIV,
Impotence.
AIDS,
Varicocele.
HIV,
gonorrhea,
HIV.
AIDS,
HIV at AIDS.
Yun yung nagkakaroon ka ng bukol sa may genitals mo. Yung cause nun, yung sobrang physical activity, tas sobrang buhat sa mga mabibigat na bagay, tas di ka nagsusuporter.
Impotence is the inability of the penis to erect itself. It is caused by fat accumulating at the root of the penis, preventing the blood from going to the penis and make an erection.
Sexual transmitted disease that can be transferred from one person to another by having sex with someone.
Yun yung parang sa testicle natin, lumalaki yung vein na syempre, magdadala siya ng sobrang sakit sa ating itlog na feeling mo may mga bulate doon, tsaka parang tsura niya may spaghetti yung itlog mo eh.
Siguro yung kakaintindi ko sa AIDS, yung parang humihina yung immune system nung taong may AIDS, tapos parang may taning na yung buhay niya. Parang ganun. Yun ang idea ko.
May idea ka ba tungkol? Pag sa lalaki daw, para malalaman mo raw na may AIDS ka, kunyari pag may tulo ka. Tapos, nakukuha yata yung AIDS pag mahilig ka makipag-sex sa iba't ibang babae. Tsaka marumi raw. Yung hindi hygienic yung babae or sa lalaki.
Sabi nila ito daw yung nagkakos ng AIDS.
Parang merong scar na tumutubo doon sa yung parang nagaano siya, nagmalaking scar doon sa part ng reproductive na nakukuha kapag nag-intercourse. Yun.
Thank you.
This would be a very short discussion regarding the common ailments of the reproductive system, and mostly coming from the female gender. So infections of the female external genitalia usually comes from the distal part or the lower part. which is the vulva. So if you have infection of the vulva, you will have vulvitis, cellulitis, and other skin infections. When the infection extends from the skin to the mucosa, which is the inner part of your vaginal canal, that's where we consider the disease as sexually transmitted. Because bacteria don't usually enter the internal genitalia unless it is sexually introduced, okay, during sexual intercourse. Once they extend, they infect the cervix, which is the distal part of the uterus. This may now be called cervicitis. Most common cause of cervicitis in females are chlamydia, gonorrhea, syphilis, and other viral infections like HPV virus, which causes cervical cancer. If the barrier from the vaginal wall and the uterine lumen is broken, the bacteria or the infective agent could enter the uterus. This will now cause uterine infection, which can extend to the fallopian tubes. So this is what we call now the pelvic inflammatory disease. This is a very serious disease which could cause death to several women who won't be treated immediately as possible. So other infections of the reproductive system also arises from other systemic problems. For example, tuberculosis. Tuberculosis is not a sexually transmitted disease. It is the tubercle bacilla usually is implanted in any part of the fallopian tube, which comes from the lungs and brought to the fallopian tubes by the blood. Others would be hormonal imbalances, like polycystic ovaries. If you have cysts in your ovaries, okay, and which could lead to dysfunctional uterine bleeding or lack of menses. Either way. So other most common cause of pelvic or uterine problems are tumors like myomas and myomatas, endometriosis or endometritis. Okay? And another would be cancer, which is tumor arising from the proliferative cells in any part of the reproductive system, mostly from the linings of the uterus, the external part of the cervix, or from the ovaries. When it comes to the male reproductive system, aside from the tumor, the most frequent problems that arises from the male reproductive system, especially in the elderly, would be the benign prostatic hypertrophy or the enlargement of the prostate. Most of them are treated medically now, not all of them undergo surgery. Others would be infections of the genitourinary system of the male, and most of them are also sexually transmitted. Others have tumors of the testes because cells in the testes are highly proliferative, so they are prone to the development of cancer. Now, the difference between cancer in male and cancer in female is that in male, cancer of the reproductive system is easily detected because their genitalia is exposed. Unlike in female, we have to do some internal examination, most of them instrumentation, to see if there are tumors arising from the cervix or from the other parts of the vagina, and ultrasound examination to see if there are tumors arising from the ovaries, from the uterus, or from the fallopian tubes. Herpes is caused by virus. So prevention of herpes is protected sex, protected sexual contact, so that the infection coming from one partner will not transfer to the other partner. So treatment is also antiviral. Gonorrhea is the most common. So they usually present with discharge. Trichomonas is also common. They present as foul-smelling discharge and pain. Chlamydia is also common. However, the discharge they produce is clear. So they are not easily detected in ordinary examination. Chlamydia is detected on special examination because the protozoan, which is the chlamyds, they are inside the white blood cells. So they cannot be detected on simple examinations. The worst would be HIV, but this is virus. Unfortunately, when it comes to STIs or sexually transmitted disease, they don't come 1-in-1. Most of them 2-in-1, 3-in-1, 4-in-1, 5-in-1. So persons having history of sexually transmitted diseases should have their HIV status known every 6 months. When it comes to diseases of the reproductive system, knowledge of the reproductive health is very important for the prevention, and early detection is important in order to cure any anomalies that will arise from the reproductive system. Congenital anomalies of the reproductive system arises from the time of the embryo, during the formation of the mesodermic organs. So these are not easily detected even if they are already there since birth. Okay, most of them are detected during the reproductive years of the person, unless the problem is in the external genitalia, wherein it is immediately seen.